I want to tell you a story about a boy named Clive. Everyone say Clive. One more time. Everyone say Clive. I am a youth pastor. You know, that's a thing I've started doing more. Retain the youth's attention. All right, never mind. To retain the youth's attention, I do a lot of repeating words now, so I kind of find that easier. But Clive is a fun name. I thought about it a little bit more this week, and I said, there's not a whole lot. That's a name you don't see a whole lot of. Anymore, at least. By show of hands, who knows a Clive personally that they could text, email, or just, I don't know, like you've met them before? Huh? It's more than I was expecting. Not going to lie. I wasn't expecting too much. But Clive was a boy who was born in Ireland. He grew up in the church. He was a church kid. He was one of those kids. I actually really relate to Clive a lot in that aspect because I'm one of those kids who I think I might have been born right in the church. I'm not sure. My parents tell me I was born at Met Hospital, but I don't know. Maybe I might have been born right within the church. I don't know. So in the church, he was raised up by a very church-going family. Every Sunday, they made sure they had him in a pew. I'm sure it was a pew at the time, and he was in Sunday school, and he was going through it all. He was every Sunday he was there. He was a regular. Everyone saw him. They say, "Morning, Clive." But he was a little kid, so he wouldn't say good morning because he's shy. But Clive would be a regular church attender. He was a church kid. His grandfather was a priest, so it kind of ran in the family. This whole church lifestyle really ran in the family. His parents were constantly going to church. His parents were constantly dragging him along, bringing him to the car or whatever. And you say, "Hey, well, you're under this roof. You're coming to church today." And Clive went. So he grew up within the church. He was baptized, and he loved to read. Clive really loved to read, which is something I cannot relate to. My wife can relate to that, but I think there are a lot of other things I would rather be doing than reading. Anyone else fall asleep as soon as they pick up a book? I don't know. Maybe I should go to the doctor, get that checked out. Maybe I got like narcolepsy or something. I'm just like, it's instant. Like I don't even get through a page and I'm out. But anyway, Clive was a reader, which I'm a little envious of. But Clive was such a reader, and he had good parents. It was the right household to be growing up a reader because his dad apparently had the biggest library, the biggest collection of books. And Clive was quoted on saying that finding something to read was about as easy as walking into a field and finding a new blade of grass. So he obviously didn't have a whole lot that he was doing outside of the home. He was burning through the pages and reading any chance he could get. He was really just immersing himself in these worlds, in these places. It was a real escape for him. So he would read. He read all kinds of books, cover to cover. But then his mother died when he was 9. And that was a big blow to the family, obviously. And he began getting sent off to schools because his dad, he had siblings, and his dad, he really couldn't handle it all. So his dad sent him off to school after school. And he was a smart kid, he loved to read. He read all those things, and he was going to some high-level schools, ones that you'd probably hear about, and you'd think Ivy League. He was going to those kinds of schools. But, things were rocky. Anytime you would assume that a child getting sent off, you watch the movies, children getting sent off to boarding schools and all that, and it never ends well. And he was getting sent to these schools and just being really distant from his family, maybe when he needed them most. So it was a challenging time for Clive. Clive was really having a troubling time, a real dark period in his life, a real challenging moment. And it got to the point where he actually would abandon his Christian faith. Around the age of 15, he would abandon his Christian faith. The part where he started to say, I got to make a choice now. And I feel like a lot of us come to that spot, that fork in the road, where all of a sudden our parents aren't driving us every week, and we say, hey, maybe I'm just not going to be going. He realized, he got to the point, he said, I don't think this thing is for me. He got to the point where Christianity, he was seeing it as a chore. He was seeing it as a chore. He was seeing it as kind of a duty, a thing that he would have to go on Sunday, almost like another kind of work, right? He had to go. But this one, he wasn't getting direct deposit when he would go home. And he just started thinking, what, maybe this isn't for me. And he was actually quoted in saying that trying to summarize his feelings, he was very angry with God for not existing. He actually transitioned to atheism. He just said, you know what, God, I'm done with that. And he was kind of caught between a place, two spots. On the one hand, he was angry with God because he said he doesn't exist. And on the other hand, he was equally angry with him for creating a world. So, he was really a little confused, but at the same time, he's got to put his anger somewhere, and it was just going in both directions. So Clive was not in a good place at this point. And it's all too common. This isn't the first time that we hear about this, where someone that we know has grown up within the church, and they reach a certain point. Maybe it's later on in life. Maybe it wasn't 15. Maybe it was 25. And they got thinking about it, and just like Clive, a parent dies. A event happens where it really shakes their faith, shakes them to the core, and they say, I don't think this is for me. And we see that time and time again in our society within the church sphere. And this story is what kind of got me thinking about finishing well. Finishing well. Say it with me. Finishing well. Fantastic. We're all awake here. Finishing well. If you think about races, who watches the Olympics? Who has watched the Olympics? Who's actively watching the Olympics that aren't going on right now? If you ever watched the Olympics, I remember 2008, I think that was Beijing Olympics. I remember watching that for the first time, and I was really into the sprinting. Really loved watching the sprints in the 100 meter, 200 meter. After 200 meter, I was like, this is just too long. It's just people jogging at this point. But 100, 200, relay was always pretty cool. And there's something about these foot races that they all share in common with, right? At the end of the day, you don't get an award for starting good. You get an award for finishing, for where you finish. Because let's be honest, you could put Usain Bolt at the very start, and he's going to smoke every one of them right off the gate. But if Team Jamaica doesn't come in first at the very end, do they get gold? No. Finishing well. That's what we're looking at today. And to kind of look at the two polar opposites, really. And coincidentally enough, they share the same name. So this will be real easy for me to remember and real hard for you to follow along. But don't worry, we're going to get through this. We're going to be looking today at two Sauls. From the New Testament and the Old Testament, we have Saul, who would become Paul, but at this time, Saul of Tarsus. In the Old Testament, we have King Saul. We're familiar with these characters, right, with these folks? We're going to look at them a little bit deeper today, starting with King Saul. See, King Saul was actually a lot like Clive. And when I go back and I was reading this part through 1 Samuel these last couple weeks, and every time I reread this introductory story of King Saul and how he started out and working his way up, I think, this guy's not that bad. At the very beginning, now keep in mind, God wasn't super excited about giving them a king and all, but I was like, as far as kings go, it seemed like a good first step. Samuel, Samuel, he was a grown man at this time, and he goes and he anoints Saul. He goes and says, Saul, you're going to be king. And the Bible, again, loves to describe the looks of these leaders when they're good looking. Because, again, like David, like Daniel, it talks about, like Joseph, it talks, he was handsome. I'm like, okay, that's humble, right? But he was a handsome guy. He was tall. He was a head higher than most folks. He was a tall guy. So, as far as looks go, I'd be intimidated by this new king. And Saul went through this whole process. He was anointed, and it got to the point where they were going to actually reveal him as king. They were going to bring him out and say, this is your new king. And when they got to ask, he says, where is Saul? Is he here? And the guy says, well, yeah, he's actually over there hiding by the supplies. So whether he was scared of crowds or he was just like a humble guy, just kind of being like, I don't want to be up there. Already you go, well, is this the same guy? Is this the same Saul that would go and throw spears at David? Can't be. Can't be. But power changes things. And King Saul had a lot of power. You see, after he was anointed by Samuel, he was made king. His heart was changed by God. and he was a good leader for a time. He was doing all kinds of great things. He was wiping out enemies, and he was leading his people, and things were going all right, but in comes the twist, right? In comes the point, the turning point, where Saul started to realize, he says, you know what, I'm a king. I am a king. I'm the king of Israel, and I got some power. You know, I'm pretty tall, pretty good looking. And he said, you know what, maybe I got some good ideas of my own. And these things started to creep into Saul's life, King Saul's life, where he started to make his own decisions. He went from calling on God on a number of occasions when that would be the first thing he would do. He would say, God, what do you want me to do? God, what is your plan? Samuel would come to him and say, here is God's plan. And he would say, absolutely, let's do it. We start to see a little bit of change. In 1 Samuel, there is an instance where Samuel had to rebuke Saul. He had to kind of give him a talking to, a little bit of a scolding, like a parent when you catch your kid with their hand in the cookie jar. Samuel had to say, Saul, don't be doing that. So what happened was Saul was given these instructions. They were going to be going against the Philistines, and he was supposed to wait. You know, like it usually goes, he's supposed to wait for Samuel to arrive. Samuel was going to do his thing. He had his stuff that he was there to do. He's paid there to, just kidding, they weren't paying him. But he was supposed to be there before he goes into battle, and Saul was getting antsy. Okay, Saul was getting a little restless. Saul was getting to the point where he'd look down and he's like, they're moving. He had an eye on the Philistines. He's like, they're moving. They're doing something. And Samuel is supposed to be here. Where's Samuel? And so it gets to the point where he actually says, you know what? Forget this. Making an offering. I wasn't supposed to, but I'm going to make an offering to God, and we're going to see what to do here. And as soon as he built the offering, Samuel comes up, walking up with his nice sandals on. He walks up and he says, Saul, what have you done? So I was right down the mountain, Saul. Why couldn't you just wait another couple of seconds? Saul says, well, you know, you weren't here. Samuel, you weren't here, so I kind of had to take things into my own hands. I am king after all. I am King Saul after all. I'm sure he probably said that a few times. That was probably his catchphrase. But he took it into his own hands. He knew what he was supposed to do, and he chose not to do it. He was supposed to wait for Samuel, and it would have tested his faith. It would have tested his faith to wait right until the very last second for Samuel to walk up that mountain. But instead he says, you know what, I actually got an extra 5-minute cushion here. I'm going to make this myself, and we're going to take care of it. Don't worry. He was trying to cover his tracks. He was trying to make sure that he was set up for success, but he took it into his own hands. And that's not what God wants. God wants obedience. For this, Samuel rebuked him. He said, Saul, don't be doing this. You know, smarten up. But unfortunately for Saul, he was already on a path. He was already having arrogance cloud his mind. He was already letting pride dictate his path. And before you knew it, we're back at a very similar situation yet again, where he was supposed to do one thing and decided to do another. Because again, Saul knows best, after all. There's another one. Maybe use that one again. Saul knew best. He was at the point where he says, my decisions are as good as God's. I'm going to do this my way. You know, he was backed in another corner, and he made another decision. So we catch up before the aftermath. Saul was told to totally eradicate the Amalekites. Say eradicate. Oh, that's a scary word. And if you know what eradicate means, you know that means wipe out. You know, that means clean slate. Does that mean leave a couple leftovers? Head should be shaken. There we go. No, that does not mean leave a couple leftovers. That doesn't mean going into the Amalekites camp and saying, oh, that woman looks pretty cute. I'm going to take her back to be my wife. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean looking and saying, oh, they have a spotted dog. He's pretty cute. Come here, boy. I'll take him home to be my pet. No, God was very clear with what he said. Samuel brings the instructions to him. He says in 1 Samuel 15, 2-3, he says, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Totally destroy. Do not spare them. He said it again. Do not spare them. Put to death men, women, children, infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Harsh. But these were the repercussions from what they had done to Israel. You see, our God is a just God. And when he says one thing, and he says, if you do this, this will happen, this will happen. When God makes a promise, he doesn't go back on it. And even when it's something that we might look at and we say, wow, that's pretty ruthless. That's pretty harsh. Who are we to determine what is harsh in God's eyes? Who are we to, stand in his way? It's a hard thing to wrap your mind around, but it's what had to happen. It was what God said Saul had to do. However, Saul just couldn't listen. Saul was faced again with a crossroads. Saul looked and saw all the good things that the Amalekites had, and he says, why can't I just take these? He saw the shiny penny sitting on the ground, and he says, who's going to notice if I pick it up? But then what he also probably said to himself is he knew the instructions, and he said, God told me to do it this way, so what I'll do is I'll ignore them. I will take what I want, and then I will offer an offering, and it'll be fine. It'll be fine. Maybe Samuel will rebuke me again. Samuel, such a pushover he is. Maybe he'll rebuke me again, but I'll have so much cattle. I'll have so many camels. There's oodles of camels at his disposal. Okay, and that was a big thing back in the day. So Saul let his pride and arrogance lead him to believe that his plans, his decisions were more important than God's, that his decisions trumped what God had originally told him to do. Partial obedience. He was partially obedient because guess what? He did kill them all, but he didn't destroy all that they had. He killed them all, but he took back some livestock, and he took back some gold, and he took back some trinkets. And partial obedience is still disobedience. When it comes to God, partial obedience is still disobedience. There's no, going between the lines and saying, oh, I thought, maybe I could do this and you'd be all right with it. It's still disobedience. And then to make things worse, he actually set up a victory monument in his own honor. Good for him. Saul, you're the man. I'm sure that'll go over fantastically. And because of this, Samuel would not just rebuke him, but God would actually reject him as king. In 1 Samuel 15, 22-23, after Samuel saw that has happened, he said, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For your rebellion, like the sin of divination, and arrogance, like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. And we know what happens after that. From that point on, there is a slow decline. Then we start to see the Saul we all know and don't necessarily love. We see the Saul that rings out through history, the one that was the one that tried to kill David, who would chase him long, long time. And right when you thought he made a breakthrough, he went after him again. He did not finish well. King Saul did not finish well. He started good. So much promise, but he did not finish well. You see, power is so dangerous, and it has a strong tendency to corrupt. Success can so easily lead to pride and arrogance, and that is what we see with King Saul. That is what we see when you allow yourself to submit to these things. When you allow yourself to get kind of a big head and you say, you know what, why can't I? Why can't I do this? But it's a long road. It's a narrow road to finishing well, and it is so important to stay the course when these challenges arise. Now we shift from someone who started well and finished poorly to someone who started very poorly but would finish well. We fast forward, we time travel a little bit into the future, and we pick up in the story of Saul of Tarsus. Saul of Tarsus, he would start out very poorly, In fact, he started out by looking on, we see the first of them as he looked on the stoning of Stephen. And Stephen was a good man who was wrongfully killed for his beliefs, for his faith. And we first read about Saul, and they say, you think at first he's just going to be a side character, and they say they gave his coats to a young man named Saul. All the people who were going to stone Stephen, they gave their coats to a young man named Saul. And you start thinking, well, he's just the coat bearer, right? He's just the coat rack for them. And he sat there and he was holding all the heavy coats. And he's looking on this guy getting stoned. Which, yikes. But it actually goes on to say, and at first he'd say, oh, well, he was just onlooking. He was put in a position, maybe he was just a bystander. But in the following chapter, the very beginning of the chapter starts out and it says, and Saul approved of their killing him. He approved. He gave the thumbs up. He said, good for you guys. He deserved to die. So who is this Saul guy? He was not a bystander. In fact, he was a participant. He was a Roman citizen born to a devout Jewish family, and they had some beliefs. These are the same line of people who were very much against Jesus. They were the religious leaders. When Jesus was walking the earth, they were the ones plotting to kill him. And Saul was coming from that sort of belief. He was a very educated fellow, but he was educated in the way to see someone like Jesus or someone like Stephen and say, they're part of the way. They called it the way at the time. They saw it as a cult, and they said, well, these guys got to die. We have to make sure that the crazies aren't getting out there, and we're maintaining what is true. So he looked at that and he said, this is completely justified. This is a completely justified cause. This is a completely justified course that I'm about to take. And in his mind, in his eyes, wiping out the way would have been seen as correct as you and I sharing the gospel with a friend. He would have seen that as just another, yep, that's a good thing to do with what I believe in, as it would be inviting someone to church. He was that comfortable with doing that. And he just said, these guys got to go. And I was so naive. All right, little time travel back to young Colt. I was so naive. And there was a lot of things I didn't realize that happened in the Bible. One is that a lot of people died that I didn't think died. I blame VeggieTales. But I got thinking about it. How would they translate Goliath dying and getting his, into a VeggieTale cartoon? So good that they didn't. That's great. He just got knocked out, and you can't tell me otherwise. Same thing for this. When I was reading about this, and it might have been like my kid's action Bible or whatever it was, and I remember reading it, and it just said, Paul was going around, Saul was going around, and he was catching Christians, and he was tossing them in prison. And they leave it at that, and I go, oh, it's not so bad. They just got tossed in prison. They're just sitting there. They probably got out. No. How naive I was. Because once they ended up there, Saul was going with murderous threats. He was breathing out murderous threats. He was not going to just let these folks sit in a cell until, you've done your time, now come on out. He knew better than that. He knew that as soon as they got out, they were going to be going right back to it. And so that's where Saul's coming from. You can imagine that Saul was kind of like, in their time, like a vigilante. He was going around doing this, and it's probably the name Saul just sent chills down the spines of believers and those who followed the way. And so this guy wasn't going to be someone that they were going to be inviting into their house anytime soon. They knew. They knew what this guy was capable of. What he was capable of until he encountered Jesus on the way to Damascus. And then his story shifted. See, his start wouldn't define him. His start as being a murderous guy who would go around and lock up all these Christians who would eventually be killed, that wasn't going to define his story. What would define his story is what happened from that moment on. At that point there, he encountered Jesus. And he had a choice to make. As soon as he got his eyesight back, because remember, he was struck blind and then his vision was restored. So at that moment, he had a choice to make. It was either go back to the same old ways, and then we'd be seeing Saul as, he wouldn't be Paul. We wouldn't look at him with such enthusiasm. But he chose instead to do something about that encounter. He encountered Jesus and he decided to do something about that. He decided that the things that he had believed, the things that had controlled him, and the things that he had held true that he now knew to be false, he left it in the past. And what was happening from that moment forward was what was going to define the rest of his story. So it doesn't matter how you start, it's how you finish. And it's when you decide to do something about it. It is. It's when you have that moment where both Saul and Paul, they reach these pivotal moments in their lives. And for King Saul, couldn't get past his own greatness, couldn't get past his own awesomeness, couldn't get past the fact that he was king. Good for him. He couldn't get past that, and so what did he do? He stayed in the same lane. But for Paul, he was quick to leave it behind. He left behind his flawed ideals, his murderous intent, and he obeyed God's call. And we might not have a lot of Paul moments in our lives. We might not get struck blind and have our sight restored a whole lot like Paul did, but sure as shooting, we're going to have some Saul moments. We're going to have moments where we are like Saul, though we're not going to war. We're sitting here and we say, I know I'm supposed to do this, but perhaps I can do this instead and bargain my way out. Perhaps I can do this instead and I'll ask for forgiveness later and it'll be all good. But when you get into that, you start to think that, hey, I can just start making my own decisions here. I can just start letting myself run this show when God is ultimately in control. Partial obedience is still disobedience. And what really helps is to remember and understand that the eternal reward for finishing well is far better than any reward we'll get down here. We got to play the long game, folks. This is King Saul was playing the short game here. We got to play the long game. We got to look ahead, and the things that we do now will define how we finish. So, how do we start here? Well, it starts with living a righteous life. And there are some things that we can do that will help us remain on the righteous path. The things that will make it easier so that when these things come up, when these decisions come up, when these pivotal moments come up, that it's that much easier to make the right decision because we're rooted well. The first thing, we're going to read about these things. I think I have 6 here, and they're all outlined in Proverbs 13, verses 1 to 6, and we're going to read these. It says, a wise man heeds his father's instruction, but a mocker does not respond to rebukes. Those who guard their lips preserve their lives, but those who speak rashly will come to ruin. A sluggard's appetite is never filled, but the desires of the diligent are fully satisfied. The righteous hate what is false, but the wicked make themselves a stench and bring shame on themselves. Righteousness guards the person of integrity, but wickedness overthrows the sinner. So, what can we get from that? There's a couple of things. 1, listen to parental advice. That's something I struggled with. I'm fresh out of the child, phase of my life. I'm still learning things, obviously, but I still see myself as that wasn't too long ago for me. I'm only 26. My arm is a little too sore for me to feel like I'm 26, and people say, oh, you'll get more sore. Thanks for that. Have that to look forward to. But listening to parental advice, it's something that I kind of wish I had took more seriously earlier, and I don't think you ever outgrow it. I don't think you ever outgrow it. Much like in the story of Samuel and Saul, in this case, I would see Samuel as a little bit more of like a parental figure, because he was coming from a wise perspective of God said this, Saul, do this. And he rebuked him like a parent would. He rebuked him like my dad would do if he said, Colt, don't do that again. Don't do that again. Obviously, I would take it seriously because I'm a model child. But listening to parental advice, that was something that Saul definitely did not do, because when he was rebuked, he still went ahead and did it the next time he was faced with a similar challenge. He did not take the rebuke seriously. He did not take this thing seriously, but instead he says, yeah, brush it off, whatever. Whereas Paul, rebuked by Jesus, said, why are you persecuting me? Took that to heart, did something about it. So listening to parental advice is a good thing that you can start to do. Kids in the back center, I see you. Not safe as soon as you're out of J Kids. Start talking about you. Second thing, guard your lips. I'm still working on this one too. All of these things are ongoing, by the way. I don't think you ever master any of these. But guard your lips, verse 3 says. And you can't overestimate the importance that your words have and the importance of controlling your tongue. You can't overestimate how important that is. You don't let your quick thinking and your sarcastic remarks paint you into a corner that you have to come back from or will bite you in the butt later. And again, that's something, I have some real zingers up there, but you gotta bite the tongue. It would have been funny in the moment, but I think back to some things later and I go, man, good thing I didn't say that. Good thing I didn't say that. So guard your lips is a wise thing to do. Work hard. Work is a blessing. Yes. Whether you believe it or not, but you can believe that work is a blessing. And success can be hard work. It requires diligent perseverance. Winston Churchill once said that success consists of going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. So a lot of times on this road, we will be faced with hard work. On this road that is our Christian faith, we will be faced with some difficult challenges. And what you would assume would happen in a perfect world is I would come across this challenge, I would be victorious, next thing, moving on. But like he says, a lot of times it can be failure and failure. What we see is like, man, this is really discouraging me. It's staying the course. When things look like failure, sometimes it's God moving in the background, just tinkering and allowing things to move in the way that he has planned for us. Because our victories look a lot different than his. Our failures look a lot different from his. So stay the course, keep on working, keep on failing. It's got to happen. Love the truth. We are to hate dishonesty and love the truth. If you're someone that quickly just decides that, a little white lie is easier, hate that. Stop that. Again, I look at these things and I say, wow, this was something that I had to grow out of. And a lot of times, man, it is easy to just want to say a little white lie just to get yourself out of something. But it adds up. It's the trials in the times when it could fix everything. Those are what build us up for the big picture. Those are what people look at and they say, why did he lie about that? And can I trust him in the future? Don't give people a reason not to trust you. Love the truth, hate dishonesty. Be a person of integrity. I think those work out really well hand in hand, because when you're honest and you have integrity, people recognize that. People realize that. And that's when you are in your place of work. That is when you are with your family or your friends who are unbelievers, and they look at you and they say, what's different about you? You are a person of great integrity. That is different from what I see a whole lot of the time. Why is that? And you can say, I just root myself in these things. I root myself in these things, and I say, this is how I am supposed to live as a Christ follower. This is how it's got to be. Can I tell you a story as we wrap up? About a man named Clive. You see, his story wasn't done yet. As he fought in the First World War, he made it through. He survived. He continued his educational pursuits, and an Oxford friend named J.R.R. Tolkien would influence Clive Staples Lewis, or you might know him as C.S. Lewis, to return to his Christian faith. See, he had gone at this point from a boy who was dragged to church and who was just really put off by all the singing of hymns and all the people around. Like he couldn't get into it. He was literally there, he said, for communion. That was it. He says, I'll go for communion. That's why I'm here. Maybe they didn't feed him at home. I don't know. But that's why he was there. He was a boy that did not care for church, and he was transformed into a man. It took some hardships, it took some struggles, but he was transformed into a man who found it to be an honor to be among everyone, men and women of faith who were there to worship the Lord. What a transformation. And then obviously he would go on to his fascination with books, his fascination with fantasy. It would go to his aid of writing the Chronicles of Narnia, which is a book series that is laced with Christian ideas and Christian thoughts. And the reason he did that is so that children could pick up these books and understand these Christian ideas. Though it's about fawns and talking beavers and centaurs, there's still some truth, some biblical truth in that. Gets kids asking questions. There's so many church kids that I know who are so greatly influenced by these books, and can you imagine how their path would have been different had he not finished well? And that's what we remember him for. Did you know who I was talking about at first? We remember who he is. We remember C.S. Lewis and other people of faith who finish well. Because it's not about how you start. You don't get a gold medal for starting quick. You get a gold medal for finishing well. Would you stand with me today as we close in prayer? Oh. Dear Lord, I just thank you for this opportunity to dive into your word. And Lord, to recenter ourselves, recenter our focus on the importance of finishing well, because Lord, it can be so easy to just go about our lives, go about our days, and not even thinking about the long game, not even thinking about the finish line that we will have to inevitably cross one day. And Lord, I pray that if some of those who are hearing my voice, wherever they are, if they are currently in the same predicament as King Saul, where they are faced with their pride and arrogance, and they're at a point where they say, I can make my own choices. I can do this my way. It's all good. Lord, I pray for a shifting right now. Lord, today, before they leave this place, I pray for a shifting in their focus, that they would understand that, Lord, to slightly obey, to partially obey, is to still disobey. Lord, I pray that they would put you back in the driver's seat, that they would obey you fully. And Lord, I thank you for the Pauls, those who have started poorly and have found themselves in a predicament like Paul, that they are on course to finish well. It doesn't matter where they came from. It's where they're going, and it's what they do with it. Lord, I pray that this would encourage them and uplift them, that throughout this journey they would be encouraged to finish well. Lord, I pray a blessing upon each and every one who hears my voice today as they go. Lord, I pray for safety and a blessing, and for just a fantastic week that is ahead. We all come back here next week safely. In your name we pray. Amen.